Okay, well, hi everyone. Thanks for joining us today for this important topic. My name's Maren Butler, and I'm the Director of Research in the Family and Community Services Insights, Analysis and Research area, also known as FACSIA at the Department of Communities and Justice. I'd like to welcome everybody to this month's Lunch and Learn research seminar on supporting children involved with child protection services and youth justice. To start with, I'd like to acknowledge that wherever we're joining today's webinar from across New South Wales, we are all living and working on Aboriginal land that was never ceded. I would like to acknowledge the Darramurrugal people, who are the owners and First Nations people of the area where I have the privilege of joining from today. I'd like to pay my respects to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, past and present, and to future and emerging leaders. I'd also like to extend that respect to our Aboriginal colleagues joining us today. I'd like to warmly welcome all the webinar participants that we have with us today. This is a topic of great interest to many. We've had over 1,500 people register for this session from a broad range of NGOs, Aboriginal community-controlled organisations, universities and government departments. The trajectory of children involved with child protection services and youth justice presents a significant and long-standing concern for both policymakers and practitioners. In today's webinar, Associate Professor Susan Baidawi will draw on a series of research studies to outline what is known about the characteristics of this group of children and their pathways to justice system involvement. She will also discuss opportunities for practice in systemic change to prevent and address these pathways. A panel of experts from relevant DCJ policy areas will also discuss what these findings mean for policy and practice. After the presentation and discussion, we will have a short Q&A if time permits. So please make sure you put any questions for our speakers in the chat box during the presentation, and we'll try to come to these at the end. Just to let everybody also know that the session is being recorded and will be posted to our FACSIA webpage. Anyone who's registered for today's webinar will receive the link to this recording within about a week. So now I'd like to introduce our presenter for this afternoon, Associate Professor Susan Baidawi, and following her presentation, I'll introduce the panel. Susan is an Associate Professor in the Department of Social Work at Monash University and is co-director of the Monash Criminal Justice Research Consortium. Her research focuses on the intersection of social welfare and criminal justice systems and populations, particularly crossover or dual system youth at the nexus of child protection and youth justice. Susan's applied research has informed policy across Australia. She was an early career research fellow of the Australian Research Council 2019 to 22 and was awarded the 2022 Monash University Vice-Chancellor's Award for Research Excellence by an early career researcher. So I'll hand over to Susan now, and thank you.
Thanks, Maren. Hi everyone, it's really wonderful to be with you here today. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the Bunurong people of the Kulin Nations, of the traditional custodians of the land on which I'm privileged to work and come forward from for you today. I'd like to pay respects to their elders past and present, and I extend those respects to Aboriginal colleagues both on the panel and in the audience today. The topic today is focusing on how children that are involved with child protection systems come to be criminalised, involved in the youth justice system in particular. I just want to introduce myself a little bit first in terms of, how I've come to some of the material that I'm going to share with you today. So I've had just over 14 years of research experience focusing on child protection and youth and adult criminal justice systems. Most recently, over the past few years, I finished a few studies that largely do focus on this same group of children and young people and their families and the services and systems around them. So recently focused on children aged 10 to 13 years who have been charged with offending, a great deal of whom are also involved with child protection systems. In 2022, I finished up a study for the Disability Royal Commission that I'll share some of the findings with you today. And in 2022, I finished up a 3-year research project funded by the Australian Research Council again on this research. So a lot of what I'll be sharing with you today arises from a particular study that was based in Victoria, but its findings resonate throughout the country. We had a look at the case files of 300 children who came before one of 3 criminal division courts in Victoria and who also had statutory child protection involvement in the state. So this really detailed case file analysis was unprecedented in Australia. We hadn't seen this number of children whose matters had been looked at before, and it led us to understand some of the trends we see in this group so that it can help us think about what policy reforms might be helpful to stopping that trajectory. So the data I'm going to present both arises from those children's court file analyses, but also a wide range of professionals that I've spoken to over several studies with colleagues. And they include youth justice professionals, child protection professionals, defence lawyers, magistrates, and workers from ACCOs and other non-government organisations across the country. So I'm really privileged to be able to share with you their reflections as well about this group of children. So what I'm going to speak to today is initially how this group of crossover children who go between the child protection and youth justice systems differ from other children that are involved with child protection services. I understand that a lot of you that are joining us today come from working in spaces related to child protection or child and family welfare. And so it's important to recognise which of your client groups this group might be more likely to be. I also want to touch on how this group vary from other children involved in the justice system. And this is really important for understanding why this group is so important from a youth justice perspective, because they do represent a significant proportion of justice-involved children. As Merrin suggested previously, we're going to talk about how these children commonly end up being criminalised. What are those pathways to criminalisation? I want to touch a little bit on the mental health and disability related needs that the research has really uncovered are prevalent for this group of children and young people. And then finally go to some perspectives from Aboriginal community controlled organisation practitioners on better responding to this group of children and their families, which I think the findings of that resonate for other children as well. So I'd just like to start by giving the example of a young man or young boy called Joseph, who was a 14-year-old Koori boy who came before one of the criminal division courts in the Victorian Children's Court. He came with 58 charges related to things like threats to kill, assaults and property destruction, but every single one of Joseph's charges were based in the residential care centre where he was placed at the time. Joseph was raised by his mother till he was 13 years old, and his early childhood did include some exposure to family violence, and his parents struggled with alcohol and drug and mental health difficulties arising from significant histories of intergenerational trauma and disadvantage. So he did see things like suicide attempts of parents and caregivers. He had 9 child protection notifications from the age of 9 to 13, but none of them were previously substantiated. Joseph was relinquished by his mother at 13 years of age when he entered residential care, and she said she couldn't take care of him because of the behavioural challenges he's presented with and the lack of support that she felt as to supporting and managing his behaviour at the time. Shortly after Joseph entered residential care, his father passed away sadly, and at that time it was seen that he had further escalations in his behaviours, and that's what led to the initial police charges. There was an independent third person at the police interviews with Joseph who raised some queries as to whether Joseph was actually understanding what was going on and what he was being charged with. The Children's Court directed Joseph to undergo assessments where he was found to have an intellectual disability, PTSD, conduct disorder and anxiety as particular mental health diagnoses. At that point, the court struck out his charges because he was deemed to be unfit to plead, so he wasn't able to be held criminally responsible or undergo a criminal trial. And at that point, Child Protection Services engaged disability services to better support Joseph. So a case where potentially that whole pathway of going down the criminalisation track was unnecessary in the case of Joseph. So broadly speaking, who are crossover children? Well, they're children who come to the attention of Child Protection Services and usually later end up in youth justice services. Sometimes it does happen the other way around, but that's really far less common. It's more common that a child enters child protection system services first. And once they do, we know any child that touches the child protection system is 9 times more likely in Australian contexts to enter youth justice systems. We know this pathway is particularly prevalent for First Nations children, who are 17 times more likely in Australia to experience that dual system contact with both of those statutory systems. If we look at it from the youth justice side of things, if you look at all the children involved with youth justice, those who are girls are more likely to have experienced child protection contact compared to the boys. But we know at any one time around Australia, at least 50% of children in custody, in youth justice custody at any one time, are known to child protection services. This group of children often have multiple child protection reports, and in terms of their contact with the justice system, it usually happens at an earlier age, and then they experience, unfortunately, a greater entrenchment in the justice system compared to other children that are involved with the justice system. This pathway is really a huge part of what generates intergenerational criminalisation of First Nations people. So our first study that we completed in 2019 led us to believe that this group of crossover children are much more likely to enter the adult justice system compared to other justice-involved children. And so a group of researchers in Queensland took that hypothesis, that theory, and they tested it with their own data in Queensland. They found that that was correct for Queensland, that disrupting adult incarceration pathways, particularly for First Nations people, particularly for First Nations men, must begin with disrupting this pathway from child protection to youth justice and looking at policy and practice in these areas. So how does this group of crossover children compare to the broader group of children that are involved with child protection systems? And I've spelled protection wrong there. So what we do know is that it's only around 10% of children that are involved with child protection services that end up becoming involved with police and the justice system. So it's not a huge proportion of child protection clients, but they are much more highly disadvantaged and complex in their needs. It's more likely to be the male clients in child protection services. It's more likely to be the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children in child protection services. Compared to other children involved with child protection services, those who end up in the justice system are more likely to have been substantiated in relation to physical abuse and neglect. The maltreatment that they have been exposed to tends to be more chronic and persistent. So it's not just one thing that happens in childhood. It tends to extend to adolescence. And they're more likely to be children who come into entering out-of-home care, particularly residential care settings. Compared to other children that go into care, this group of children tend to enter care at a later age. Once they're in care, they tend to experience more placement instability, so they get moved around a lot more, and they tend to have, compared to other children in out-of-home care, a greater degree of emotional and behavioural regulation difficulties. And from what we can see from the research, these tend to arise from a combination of that intergenerational trauma with or without, but very commonly with, the presence of some kind of diagnosed or undiagnosed disability. As I said, I'll just touch on as well how this group differ from other children that are involved in the justice system. These groups tend to come in contact with justice systems much younger than other justice-involved children. They're more likely to be Aboriginal than other justice-involved children, and they're more likely to be girls. They have that earlier police and youth justice system contact. So if we're looking at 10, 11, 12-year-old children that are in touch with justice systems around Australia, they're much more likely to be this child protection crossover cohort. They're more likely to experience entrenchment in those systems and, as I've said, greater likelihood of involvement and progression, unfortunately, to the adult criminal justice system. Compared to other children in the justice system, we also see greater likelihood of violent charges, reoffending, or at least, re-prosecution, a greater number of charges, and more time in custody, including remand. And we'll touch later on some of the reasons behind that might be. In terms of the families, they tend to come from families that experience more parental and household challenges and disadvantaged, even compared to other children in the justice system. So much more complex needs and much more necessity for support than other justice-involved children. The support needs that we see for this group of children, even if we're looking at children that are sentenced to youth justice supervision, it's more complex when they are coming from child protection system involvement. They tend to have greater alcohol and drug challenges, higher level of diagnosed disability, and more needs related to mental and emotional health and wellbeing. So what are the key pathways to the criminalisation of this group of children and young people? So what I'm going to present is kind of what we saw over and over again as a pattern. I'm not going to say that it's for every child, but there are some common threads that we kept observing. and hearing about. And so starting from this top left-hand corner here, so the children that we looked at that had been in the criminal division and also had statutory child protection involvement, of course, the vast majority of them had tended to have some kind of childhood adversity, most often, maltreatment or something of the like. And they also, one half of the children who we looked at had been diagnosed with some form of neurodisability. This often led to behaviour regulation challenges. So 72% of children had some kind of recognition in their files that they had challenges regulating their emotion and behaviour. This often was part of the reason, but not all of the reason, why many of these children experienced school exclusion, so suspensions and expulsions. We saw that at least 36% of the children who were crossing over had experienced suspensions or expulsions, and in 8% of cases, they first came at the age of primary school years. So this was not something that was happening only in secondary school years. These children being excluded from these pro-social environments at very young ages. At least 20% of the young people who we looked at had some indications of using adolescent family violence in the home. Didn't always come with intervention orders, but sometimes did. A great number of them entered into out-of-home care with or without some kind of intervention order precipitating that movement. So often I'd be interested to hear if it's similar in New South Wales, but definitely in Victoria, there's been increasing use of intervention orders with children in family homes, and that has sometimes led to children being excluded from family homes where they might be using problematic behaviours because of younger children in the house, and that precipitating their entry into out-of-home care. Once they're in care, over 1/3 of the children in residential care were seen to be criminalised in these contexts. By that I mean that the charges that they came to the court with were all or most or at least some of them based in their residential care context. So very often charges relating to criminal damage in those contexts, sometimes assault, and often, criminal damage would be by far the most common one there. We also saw what we described as criminal exploitation. This is something which is more probably recognised in the UK context than the Australian context, but is something that people, especially lawyers and people that work in this sector, are becoming more attuned to. By criminal exploitation, we mean the involvement of older peers and adults in coercing or trying to draw this group of children into offending behaviours. And that might just be because they want to feel that they fit into the out-of-home care environment, they want to feel safe, they want to feel accepted, and they want a sense of belonging. But it's certainly a form of exploitation which we think is quite poorly recognised at the moment. We know both in Australia and from the research from the UK that it's children in residential care contexts that are particularly vulnerable to this, and particularly those children that have neurodisabilities as well. Finally, we see that this group of children have really limited support to navigate criminal justice system processes compared to children that might be living at home with family and have, supportive parents around. And they also have limited support in that leaving care time. So this leaves them more vulnerable to more involvement and entrenchment in the justice system than many other children. So one example of that is even looking at the case of support letters when these children go to court. For those children that are in out-of-home care, we see much lower use of support letters to the magistrate at the time of sentencing, for example. So children that are living at home with parents, they might have a letter from school, they might have a letter from mum or dad, they might have a letter from, a friend saying that they're a good friend to my child or something. We see far less of those uses of those kinds of letters that kind of give the magistrate or judge a better sense of the all-round experience of a young person, and that humanises them as a person. Far less of that kind of support for children in out-of-home care in particular. So overall, what I've kind of taken to describing this as is we see this outcome where there's a impact of what we call criminogenic risk and systemic disadvantage. So there's been a lot of talk over many, many years now about whether this overrepresentation of children from child protection systems and out-of-home care systems in the justice system is just a result of them having higher levels of all kinds of, what the psychologists call risk factors. Things like having experienced maltreatment or things like that, or intergenerational disadvantage and trauma. What our research really clearly shows is it's not just that criminogenic risk, it is a whole bunch of points at which the systems actually inflate each child's risk of being involved in the justice system. And we saw that across, the idea of being excluded from school settings, the idea of being placed in residential care settings with other children that might be involved in the justice system more deeply. We see it across a variety of systemic choices we make as a society about how we respond to this group of children. So I'll just touch on a few of these points. So this particular paper focused on children in residential care, and it really drew on the perspectives of professionals to really try to nut out what are these systemic contributors to these children being criminalised, because they are criminalised at very high rates. Certainly, we saw that placement with justice-involved peers was a key one. So a child that had never been involved in the justice system might have had some behaviours of adolescent family violence in the home, being placed in residential care placements where there's 1, 2 or more peers that are just coming out of custodial settings into those placements. Now, we know that having peers that have involvement in the justice system is a significant risk factor for children to be involved in the justice system, and yet here sometimes it is the system that places children in those contexts. We see also in residential care settings the criminalisation of behaviours of concern. So by that we mean services responding in a criminalising way to children's behaviours that might arise out of trauma or neurodisability. I know several jurisdictions, including New South Wales, have set up now frameworks to try and disrupt that outcome, and I'm sure we'll hear about those frameworks later on in the talk and in the presentation. We also see a greater use of remand and detention with children that are in residential care. Speaking to lawyers and people that are involved with this group of children, it can sometimes be children being placed in remand and the system itself needing to find a different placement, for example, a residential care placement or a foster placement, and that taking more time than it would take, say, for a parent to come and just pick up their child. That results in that child spending more days in remand, which itself is criminalising. We're talking about children at a tender age, their ideas and their concepts of themselves and their identity are being shaped every day by the ways that people respond to them, particularly adults. So placement in those kinds of settings is really telling that child, you are a criminal, and that's why we are placing you in detention. This group of children experience greater surveillance by virtue of being in residential care settings, and as I said previously, often have limited support to navigate the legal system compared to other children that are not in residential care. There's also, in Victoria, we saw very limited applicability of sentencing considerations. I was pleased to see in the new Youth Justice Bill that's going to be brought out in Victoria, it is asking for out-of-home care placement, child protection involvement and trauma to be considered in the sentencing of children in the criminal division of the court. So there should be some amendment to that particular one. It's not all negative. We do see positive outcomes for children in residential care where there are well-functioning care teams. And this seems to really rely on the good relationships that staff, professionals have built up with each other and built up with family and community to result in better outcomes for children. The other thing is in therapeutic placements. So where placements are actually in practice specifically therapeutic, we tend to see better outcomes for children there. I've touched a little bit on the mental health diagnoses and symptoms that are really common for this group of children and young people. So among the study of 300 children that we looked at, we saw that 61% had been diagnosed with a mental health diagnosis. Mood disorders were common among 28% of children. 20% of children had been diagnosed with a behaviour disorder, and 23% had been diagnosed with a trauma or attachment-related disorder. We also saw very high rates of self-harm and suicidal ideation in this group of children and young people, so 35% overall, but this was even more common among the girls who crossed over between child protection and youth justice. And as a result, very understandably, we see a high degree of self-medication via substance use for this group of children and young people, but interestingly, quite similar rates around mental health and substance abuse between First Nations and non-First Nations children. So there weren't huge differences there. Another issue that came up for us to look at was the issue of neurodisability. This hadn't really previously been flagged as an issue of concern for this group of children at the time that we were doing this work, but I think it's much more better recognised these days. So across the children that we looked at, 48% had been diagnosed with a neurodisability. Now, if any of you have tried to support children to get diagnosed with a neurodisability, you know that that's a very difficult undertaking and a complex process. So we suspect that this number is actually an underrepresentation of what is actually there, and that we hear from professionals that they suspect that many other children have a neurodisability but have remained underdiagnosed. So most commonly this related to ADHD, but nearly 1/4 of children had been diagnosed with a learning or communication disability, and 17% had been diagnosed with an intellectual disability. Similar to what you see in the broader population, neurodisability was much more common among boys than girls among crossover children. So 59% of boys had a diagnosed neurodisability compared to 29% of girls. But intellectual disability was also seen to be more common in the regional areas that we looked at. And again, similar rates for First Nations and non-First Nations children. But what we saw was a whole great deal of more vulnerability among the crossover children with neurodisability. They tended to have experienced more cumulative maltreatment, so more substantiations and notifications. They tended to have entered out-of-home care earlier than other children. They tended to have a more, I don't like the use of this word, but I have, if you know a better one, please tell me, more caregiver relinquishment. So more caregivers that are saying, I've had trouble, I need more support, and I can't manage to take care of this child at the moment. And also earlier for police charges compared to other children. So what we can see there is there seems to be some connection between neurodisability and really early and young levels of criminalisation of children, particularly in child protection systems. So we had a chat to many professionals about the issue of diagnosis of disability in both the child protection cohorts and also crossover children specifically. They continually spoke to us about a lack of diagnosis, delayed diagnosis, underdiagnosis of neurodisability. We heard that child protection practitioners often had difficulties engaging with families. Families could be transient or experience instabilities. And there was also significant difficulties accessing assessments, and that was really inconsistent across different areas and regions. There was often also issues with statutory and medical definitions of disability not quite matching what this group of children presented with, or it being difficult to get it acknowledged and I guess responded to via the NDIS processes. There was certainly concerns about a medical model of diagnosis. We often saw with children there was multiple diagnoses over different ages, and it really depended where the practitioner had come from, what they would diagnose a child with. So if they were coming from a more child protection orientation, they might say it's complex trauma. Then they, might go to a school psychologist. Oh, it's ADHD. Then they'll go into youth justice, and now it's conduct disorder. This leads to a whole mishmash of diagnoses and really very little in the way of knowing how best to support children and families in a coordinated way. What became really clear both from our research and the previous research is the later a child is diagnosed with that has a neurodisability or a disability of some sort, the higher their risk of criminalisation, particularly in relation to those disability-related behaviours and the criminalisation of those. In the 300 children we looked at, we saw that 30% of those crossover children who had an intellectual disability were only diagnosed after youth justice system involvement. So that commonly 14, 15, 16 years of age. So there's a lot of missed opportunity to support children and families earlier than this particular pathway. I'd just like to move on now to the care criminalisation study. So this study was commissioned by the Disability Royal Commission. It was undertaken with First Nations colleagues at the University of Western Sydney, Dr. Scott Avery and Robin Newitt, researchers at Monash University and researchers at the Centre for Evidence and Implementation. And it was really looking at further digging into how these children with disability in child protection systems are coming to be criminalised. I want to focus here on findings that came from speaking to practitioners that worked in Aboriginal community-controlled organisations. We conducted for this study 5 consultations with practitioners that worked in ACOs, and these were across Victoria, Western Australia and the Northern Territory. And the themes that came out of these consultations really were around the challenges understanding, assessing, recognising and responding to disability, particularly in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children and families, the need for culturally safe and appropriate services and systems, how to disrupt those pathways to criminalisation, particularly focusing on educational exclusion and entry to residential care. And they also commented on some broader systemic barriers and needs of children and families in child protection systems. So on the first theme, understanding, recognising and responding to disability, practitioners spoke about difficulties understanding and defining disability in the families that they came into contact with. So they said many families do not like the word disability because they think it's their fault because during pregnancy or whatever, there's still a lot of, still within the community, lack of understanding that you could be anyone and you could have a child with a disability. And a lot of practitioners also spoke to stigma of disability within various communities, not just Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities, but other culturally diverse communities as well, and the needing to think about this in a different way, how we go about approaching these issues and talking about them. Practitioners spoke about the need for earlier and more appropriate disability assessments and interventions. One said the children's engagement in assessments depends on them trusting whoever's arranged the assessment. And a lot of kids don't think they've got a disability and they're just being ordered around to go and do these things. They don't have any real understanding of why. So needing that relationship and needing that connection and needing that understanding to go and undertake those assessments and supports. Practitioners also spoke to responding to diagnosed or undiagnosed disability among the parents of the children that are involved in child protection services. So one practitioner said, the NDIS expect that a lot of things are deemed as parental responsibility. And when we've got parents with disabilities trying to support kids with disabilities and child protection's involved, NDIS still don't see that the parental responsibility needs to be shifted. So a lot being expected of parents to navigate, often by themselves, very, very complex systems that, you know, I know any one of us would often struggle with. The need for services and systems that are culturally appropriate and safe obviously came up from practitioners. They spoke to that disability systems, but also mental health and physical health systems and challenges are conceptualised in ways that really rely solely on Western frameworks often. So, for example, one practitioner said young people, they can't sleep in youth detention because it's an adult prison for young Aboriginal people. People have died in there, so they say it's like they feel like there are spirits around. They feel culturally unsafe. There's also this kind of symptom of a real longing for country and missing it and being so far away. There's a lot that's missed out there in terms of the ways that a lot of Western systems understand or don't understand the needs of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children. And we know there's a lot of Aboriginal practitioners. I think of the work of Tracy Westerman and others that are coming forward and recognising the need for different understandings and different approaches here. They also acknowledge that, you know, while there is this lack of understanding, there is also limited funding for culturally specific services and programs. So one said that money for supporting Aboriginal and children and families goes to big non-Aboriginal not-for-profits, and none of the money goes to Aboriginal community-controlled organisations to assist these kids and their families. ACCOs only have the capacity to work with a small number of children within each region. So that's based on that funding deficit that we're seeing, when they know that there's so many other children out there that they could be helping, but they don't have the capacity to do so. So in terms of the pathways to criminalisation and addressing school exclusion and entry to residential care, we had this wonderful example given by a practitioner who said, I've seen a young person who was removed from her family, placed in a residential care unit. All the offending happened there within 7 months. They just kept escalating. And then after being moved to a culturally appropriate placement, she moved to a stable family with an Aboriginal family. That has really changed things. She's in a stable placement. She's connecting to the community and culture. She's in the culturally appropriate placement. I think that's really important. I think that's really had a significant impact on her, getting the right support and getting back on track and seeing life a different way. So supporting that reconnection is clearly something that's going to be integral to stopping these pathways. Other recommendations were really interesting around the thoughtful use of language. So one said, when we go to the NDIS, before we go and have a meeting, we actually say to them, please do not use the word disability. Explain to the young person what's going on with their cognitive thinking, and we don't call it a disability. The language that they're not getting only called criminal, they're getting told that they've got brain damage and they're useless at the end of the day. So really needing to think about the way we explain to children and families and we take them through these processes about what's going to actually be helpful and what might just be furthering that damage and harm. And also prioritising families' needs. Sometimes families want other things addressed first. Yes, we want you on board to help with my son's disability, but I've got a rat infestation in my house. My house is not big enough for my 4 kids, where 2 of them have got intellectual disabilities. I need to actually move house before I can clearly even start working with you to help my kids with disability, because I need to tick one thing off at a time. So actually working with families about where they're at is another suggestion there. Training and education. One practitioner said services should have to undergo some sort of training education course. This is how you work with a family. Now, let's talk about how you work with a family with disability. This is where the gap is. There is no education for these other professionals to come in and know how to work with a family with disability. And then finally, diverse and culturally appropriate therapeutic options. So one practitioner acknowledged counselling, sitting on one-on-one does not always work. We need to look into music, art. I've seen camping works well, especially going out bush. First Nations kids have grown, and many have heard from their families, brothers, cousins about going fishing, going camping, sitting by a campfire. It's healing in itself, being on country, sharing Dreamtime stories and so forth. So we need to look at other options, not like you must engage with mental health counsellor. There are other ways to heal. So if you provided a link here to the summary of the Disability Royal Commission report that we prepared and some recommendations, and it goes through each system and recommendations for each system. I've focused here on child protection system recommendations, and there's a list here of what factors that the research identified are associated with a higher chance of children being criminalised and factors that are protective. I want to draw to your attention the protective factors. So provision of intensive family support services. So before no child removal, intensively supporting a family, that has been consistently shown in the literature to actually be really good at preventing these pathways. Keeping with children with family wherever possible, making sure that we don't place children in care for reasons of their own behaviour. Ensuring for those children that are in care that they can experience as much placement stability in out-of-home care as possible. Having residential care as more effective care teams, keeping it as a specialist therapeutic placement, and focusing on placement routine and stability if children have to be in those environments. But where they don't have to be, placement with siblings or kin has been shown to be really protective, and also supporting connection to community and culture. I want to touch also on the fact that there's a lot of opportunities for collaborative practice change with other systems as well. So recognising that most people here today might be working in the child and family space, but recognising that facilitating that early disability assessment and support and culturally responsive service provision around disability will also be really important. Anything that workers can do to reduce school exclusion and advocate for school stability, to challenge punitive approaches to behavioural manifestations of trauma and disability in the education system will go a long way to helping stop this pathway. And finally, anything that we can do to support more pro-social connections for this group of children and young people, with pro-social peers, with cultural mentors, other mentors, and pro-social activities, supporting their connection to culture, and improving service systems collaboration and integration. And finally, making sure we reduce institutional racism and violence in the way that we approach this group of children and young people. I hope that gives you a relatively good overview of a whole bunch of things I wanted to touch on today. There will be the links to all the papers here, but I wanted to round out by saying, from what I've shown you today, I hope you can see that this is, from my view, not a trajectory and a pathway that one system can tackle alone. What I would love to see personally is, even at a Commonwealth level, some kind of leadership around what we should be doing as over multiple sectors to be preventing these pathways. And at a state level, I equally think that it needs to be a cross-sectional and a cross-sectorial effort, including with Aboriginal community-controlled organisations at the lead, to be facilitating change in these areas, because it's never going to be able to be facilitated by just one area or service provision model. So I will leave it at that. That's my contact details. Feel free to get in touch if you would like. I'm happy to share other papers if you run into anything and want some further understanding. More than happy for you to email me. Lots of references. There are the papers, and I will pass back to Merrin.
Thanks, Susan, for that wonderful presentation. It was very informative, and you're getting lots of thumbs up and hearts. So I'm sure that our participants agree with that. So we'll now move on to the live panel discussion. And on our panel today, we've got Catherine White. So Catherine's the Manager of Residential Care Policy in the Department of Communities and Justice. Catherine has 7 years' experience working in out-of-home care policy, with a focus on improving outcomes for children in residential care. Prior to her current role, Catherine worked in disability in both policy and clinical roles. We've also got Jason here today. So Jason Phillips is a proud Wongabon man, Wiradjuri man, who lives in Dubbo. He's currently the Aboriginal Practice Officer in Youth Justice, and his goals and aspirations are to be an active participant and positive influence within his community, while supporting young people to grow and develop into what they want to be. And we also have Edwina Crawford, who's a proud Bakinji woman from Western New South Wales. Edwina is the Director of the Aboriginal Services Unit in Transforming Aboriginal Outcomes in DCJ. Edwina has over 25 years' experience working for the New South Wales Government in Aboriginal affairs and is responsible for leading a team of Aboriginal staff across New South Wales to deliver programs and support to Aboriginal court users. Edwina is a key leader in DCJ, working closely with ALS New South Wales and ACT to develop joined-up actions to help New South Wales meet the Close the Gap justice targets. So we'll start with Catherine. So Catherine, I suppose, what are your reflections when you hear the research findings? And can you tell us about some of the work that's currently underway for children and young people in out-of-home care?
Thanks, Maren. Before I start, I'd just like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that I'm on. I'm on the land of the Barramadigal, and pay my respects to elders past, present, and extend that respect to Aboriginal people on this call. Thanks, Susan. That presentation was really very insightful and relevant for my work. So as Maren said, I work in residential care policy, and I think a few reflections is it just really highlights the complexity of children and young people in residential out-of-home care, which is consistent with our kind of understanding and feedback through the program. I think that importance of early intervention approach across the child protection continuum to keep more children at home is really important. In New South Wales, we try to keep residential care purposefully limited to a small number of children with a preference for home-based care wherever possible. And ITC is really, intensive therapeutic care is our residential care system, and it's really targeted at children and young people with the most complex needs. A few years back, we were designing and commissioning a new residential care model, and we did make an intentional decision to implement a therapeutic care model with a focus on recovery from trauma. So I definitely reflected on the systemic disadvantage for children in residential care and the overrepresentation of these children with youth justice. But I think one of my reflections was it was reassuring to hear that well-functioning care teams and therapeutic placements are linked to positive outcomes. So the intensive therapeutic care model that we're introduced back in 2018 is focused on 10 essential elements of therapeutic care, and there are a lot of kind of synergies between the protective factors that you presented on that last slide with the intent of intensive therapeutic care, and care teams is one of those essential elements, which really kind of provide that holistic approach to understanding and supporting the needs of the young person. So I guess my other reflection is that we don't have it perfect. There's obviously so much more we can do to improve the experiences of children and young people in out-of-home care, and there's a lot of really great kind of practice and policy improvements that that Susan spoke through, and there's also a lot of kind of current reviews around the out-of-home care system, which just highlight how much more work there is to do. But I think one of my reflections will be just that alignment between the research findings and our kind of policy intent is promising, but we need to kind of keep working hard to make that a reality in the lives of the children and young people that we support. There's quite a few pieces of work that we're doing in this space, but I think one of the things I would like to talk about is the frameworks that Susan was talking about earlier in terms of, I guess, disrupting that pathway to criminalisation, and that's what we call the joint protocol to reduce contact of children and young people in residential care with the criminal justice system. This has been in place since 2016 between GCJ, New South Wales Police, ABSEC, and the Association of Children's Welfare Agencies, so with our sector peaks. The protocol supports trauma-informed responses, and some of its aims, these are not all of them, but some of them are to reduce the frequency of police involvement in responding to behaviour by young people living in ITC, which would be better managed kind of within the context of ITC service delivery. Promoting principles that criminal charges will not be pursued against a young person if there is an alternative, an appropriate means of dealing with that matter, and facilitating a shared commitment from police and ITC services to a collaborative early intervention approach. The protocol is supported by a range of stakeholders and governance structures at a statewide and local level. And all staff who work in our intensive therapeutic care homes must complete foundational training on the joint protocol, which is available, a free standardised training module. The feedback that we have on the protocol is that where there's good local relationships, talking to Susan's point about relationships, where there are those good local relationships between police and providers, this does result in positive impacts on things like managing bail conditions, at-risk behaviours, police call-outs, missing person reports, and linking young people with diversionary programs. And if I've got time, I'd just like to share a case study, if that's okay, Merrin, time-wise. Yep. This is about a young person, Mike, obviously not his real name, who lives in one of our residential care homes. So Mike's behaviour was escalating, particularly over the Christmas period, which was resulting in significant physical violence. After these incidences, the youth workers at the house spoke with Mike to help him reflect on his behaviour and strategies that he could use to manage his behaviour. The therapeutic specialist, which is a designated position that we have in our ITC service system supporting each home, spoke with the residents in the house about their interactions with each other, and also spoke to the house staff about ways to update Mike's behaviour support plan to better support him. The house manager also worked with the police youth officer and asked them to come to the house to speak with Mike to focus on how to get through particularly this emotionally difficult period, as we know that Christmas can be with behaviours and emotions escalating for a lot of young people who are not with their family. And the scenario was, if the physical violence continued, Mike was at risk of being charged. And apologies, I think there was a comment about my sound. I'm just going to push through. The discussion included possible diversionary programs and looked also discussion around what mentoring and positive social interaction support could be provided with Mike. The youth officer suggested a referral to a mentoring program which engages young people through bonding while caring for animals and agricultural education and work. And there was a lot of joint work between the house manager and the youth officer to support Mike's access to this program and gauge its suitability for him. Mike enjoyed animals and he looked forward to the opportunity to spend time with a pet dog, and this drew him into the program, and engaging in that program was included in his behaviour support plan. This program was a really positive experience for Mike and resulted in improved behaviour and well-being and reduced his risk of entering the criminal justice system. Through that program and his kind of improved well-being, he also began a TAFE course and really saw a stabilisation in behaviour, which supported him to be able to also think to his future and move into a supported independent living placement. So just wanted to share that as a story of how that protocol and that collaborative early intervention has worked in practice, to see his trajectory changing from that increased risk of contact with the criminal justice system to actually pursuing education, which we know is such a positive factor, and building independent living skills. Thanks, Merrin.
Thanks, Catherine. Thanks for sharing that case study. That's really nice to hear. So we'll go to Jason now. So Jason, I suppose the same question. What are your reflections when you hear the research findings? And I suppose what are some of the initiatives currently underway in the youth justice space? And, as a practitioner, what are your tips when working with young people in youth justice with a child protection history?
Thank you, and thanks, Susan. Thanks very much for the opportunity. I'd like to take the opportunity to acknowledge the traditional custodians of where I'm at, the Wiradjuri people, past, present, and future. When it comes to reflections, and as Catherine said, it might not be perfect at the moment, and I really, I was thinking about that, and I might not be able to control how perfect we are holistically, but I can really, really work on myself, and that's something that I'd like to speak to today as well. So part of my reflection is what I've done, why I've done it, how can I adapt my practice to ensure that I advocate on behalf and meet the needs of our young people that trust me. And that's right down on my level. So I really, really want to talk to that. So I'd like to take this opportunity to focus on family and community and cultural engagement and reinforce the importance of cultural connections through meaningful and trusted relationships. Hopefully I can provide some useful practice tips and examples. As we know, we're an integral part of our young people's world, and we're really the linchpin between them maintaining positive relationships with their communities as well. So as we all know, young people, especially Aboriginal children who are separated from their families, may be at risk of losing the connection to the culture, impacting on their sense of identity, belonging and well-being, which has been spoken about. So when we're working with our young people, our priority should be the connection to culture, family and community. And some simple and effective examples of this could be bushwalking. I heard some examples raised, and what I really want to do now is link what the example is to how impactful it can be. So bushwalking, so that's a connection to nature, as we heard. Dancing, so connecting to Mother Earth. Fishing, connecting with each other, so spending some time with each other. And one person said to me one time, it's not about how many fish you actually catch, you know that, don't you? Some music, connecting with self. NAIDOC Day, Corey and Murray knockouts, the rugby league knockouts, so that's connecting with community. Language, so connecting with identity. One of the practice ways that you can actually dig down into language is using the Aboriginal language maps. So asking the young person to identify where they may be, where family may be, and remember that when we do this, that it's actually got to be individually planned and meet and tailored to the young person's needs. So if we were to sit down with the language map, make sure that the young person doesn't feel like they have to have the answers. As one of my colleagues has said to me most recently, Les Toomey, he said, all young people don't need to know what their culture is, and we shouldn't make them feel like they need to know it. A lot of our young people don't. What we need to do is make sure that they feel safe. And if they don't have the answers to it, that's okay. That's okay. It's what we do to support them through that process. And the language map, if a young person can't identify where they may be historically or traditionally, we can use that language map to identify the language that's spoken within the local community that they're actually residing in, and can link them back to the community as well. So it can be used that way. So an example of cultural connection, and is a cultural story. This is not my example. I don't own this. This is owned by South Coast Mob, and it may not be a new initiative, but it's a really, really great initiative. And its purpose is to support the young person through their cultural connections, and how they do that is identify who they are, where they're from, the language group, that they may know that they're from or may speak. And the questions are really, really simple, but the key to it is how they're asked. They're asking to learn. They're not asking just to find out a question and then tick a box and then move on. They really, really want to get to know the young person and learn about that. So be genuine and authentic. Involve the young person by using the language map. Allow them to identify, where they're from and what they know about it. So the priorities and principles of engagement and trust is something that I really, really want to speak about as well, and hopefully provide some tips around that. So in practice, one of our core things to focus on is resilient. So to fully support a young person, you'll need to walk with them, be there all the way. This journey may take 5 or 6 turns, but stay with them. So be prepared to try new things, think outside the box. You may be the only community connection that the young person has to stay in the game. So one of the examples that I had for that is we've recently been working with a young girl, and she was really, really disengaged from all her community connections. And we continue to try different ways, and we weren't really getting any, having much success. So what we did was we branched out and we asked some of our colleagues that weren't actually within our area, our local area, and they happened to be 2 really, really strong Aboriginal female women. And they said, yeah, for sure, let's go and we'll help out with this. Well, when they come in, they actually recognised the young girl immediately and had that connection. And then what we'd worked out was that the system had mistakenly had the wrong last name for the young girl that was in care, and she'd sort of been lost to her family and those connections. So by thinking outside of the box and reaching out to other people within the agencies or even external agencies really, really allowed this young person to move forward, and we helped her out that way. So we were really flexible. Be flexible. It's if it's not working, try something different. Not run one approach fits all. So be prepared to change direction. Young people's lives are forever changing. Be prepared to change with them. A young person's motivation to change could be positively affected by new relationships, a new role model, someone they trust and believe in. Be prepared to change with them. Consistent. As we know, what we do is difficult at times. Stay in the game, even if the results aren't there to be seen. By being consistent, you're building trust with them. Trust is the most valuable asset you have. Trust gives you time and is the most valuable resource we have. Time is the only thing that you can't get back. And no matter how much you want to spend, you can't buy time. So by building the trust, it's actually allowing you the time to sit with our young people. Be humble. Remember, meeting the needs of young people comes first. Put aside your professional goals and put the young person's safety and well-being at the front of everything you do. Take time to reflect on your own personal biases. Ask yourself, are my biases influencing my approach? Now, that's really, really important. And that's reflection. You've really got to take a sit or take a back seat on this and then have a really, really good look at yourself. So an example, I was working with a young fella in a remote community, and he was living in a 2-bedroom house with his extended family. So it was Nan and Pop, and he had 10 other kids in the house. The house was a 2-bedroom house. Now, to some people, that may not seem normal, but to the young fella, he loved it. He could get a game of footy at home every single day. So as I said previously, his needs will eventually change, but be prepared to change with them. But at the moment, he's loving life at home. So be aware of your own biases. So I suppose in closing, I really want to reinforce a young person's cultural connection to family and community. So to help support a young person with their cultural connections to their family and the community, get out in the community. Find out who the Aboriginal controlled organisations are and what they provide. Find out who the Aboriginal health services are and how they can support. The non-government organisations. Meet with the local police and especially the Aboriginal liaison officers and the local PCYCs. So really, really quickly, we we met with a PCYC in a remote community, and they were having trouble engaging, like a lot of our young people. So we went out on country and we sat around a fire and we had a bit of a yarn and a bit of a feed, and we worked through, we were the conduit or the mediation between the two, the young person and the PCYC. And what we found out was something really, really simple. The young people wouldn't attend the PCYC because at the times that they were required or were asked to attend, there was young people there, and they didn't feel like they'll be treated like young adults. They felt like they're being treated like young kids. So all the PCYC did was just change around some of their time slots. Now, it went from having 1 or 2 young people engaged in utilising the PCYC to 200 kids. And this happened basically immediately. And it was just one really, really simple conversation. So get out in your communities, become the conduit between the young person and your local community. So link the young person to community based on what they've said they need. Don't just assume that because you feel it's the right thing, that it is the right thing. Always ask your young person. And they'll also identify safe places and safe environments that they actually want to be exposed to and where they want to do their work. It could be the local park. It could be the PCYC. It could be just going fishing. And engage and empower families and community in becoming the cultural authority. By getting out in your community, it's engaging your local community to become the cultural authority. And I really believe this. It takes a village to raise a child. So thank you.
Thanks, Jason. They were great tips. So Edwina, I suppose the same question for you, really. What are your reflections on hearing the research findings, some of the current initiatives that you've got underway in Teo, and some of your tips for working with young people in youth justice with a child protection history?
Thanks, Erin. Warami Wallama Bami, everyone. I'm coming from the land of the Baramatical people of the Darug Nation, and Warami Wallama Bami in the Darug language means hello and welcome, no matter where you're coming from today. Susan, thank you very much for a really insightful presentation. For those of us that have been in the criminal justice space for a while, it's really important to kind of resubmit those issues that we know have been really prevalent with young people and their contact with the system. But in particular, I really want to applaud the highlight that you put in the presentation on, I guess, on cognitive impairments and disabilities. It's certainly something that we need to address more strongly here in New South Wales, and the First Nations Disabilities Network here, through our work in Closing the Gap, have really been pushing for that, because we know that there's a lot of behaviours that often get criminalised, but they need a health response, and being able to get kids the diagnoses and the support that they need, particularly in rural remote locations, isn't always easy. So it's really good to see that really amplified in your research, and I'm sure everyone got lots of great insights about some of those connections between how we can better support young people and really reaffirm what we understand are the underlying drivers in that space as well. In the Transforming Aboriginal Outcomes division, our focus is really about keeping Aboriginal families safe and strong, and the centrepiece of that work is really putting families at the centre of everything that we do, putting culture at the centre of everything that we do, because we understand it's such a protective factor and such an important part of a person's hurt journey, healing, whether recovery, and just general strength and engagement. And then also looking at how we can share authority with Aboriginal people and our families, so they have some agency in the discussions and decisions that are made about them, and that those that are outside of DCJ also have an opportunity to come in and be involved in some of the decision-making processes here we have at DCJ. And we know in the justice space, we have particularly the court space, that we know that when we share authority and decision-making with Aboriginal people, we can reduce overrepresentation in our justice system, and both circle sentencing and youth Koori Court here in New South Wales are great examples of programs that keep our people out of custody and reduce that harmful contact by custodial episodes. So they are really important parts of the work that we do. So in the Transforming Aboriginal Outcomes space, we do both criminal justice work as well as child protection work. But I wanted to specifically focus today on a particular piece of work, a particular project that's happening in transforming Aboriginal outcomes that really lends itself to this conversation, and that is the work of One Mob, One Job. And for those of you who have been around in DCJ, you would have heard of it being called the Common Clients Project. And what that really has done is leveraged our understanding of the families that we've got across DCJ that have multiple contacts. So our colleagues here in FACSIA and the Bureau of Crime Statistics and Research spend a lot of time mapping out families that are involved in our system, both Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal. And there are about 8,000 families across DCJ that have had multiple contacts with us over a really long period of time. And what the One Mob, One Job work is trying to do is really transform and streamline the efforts in DCJ, so we can really get families the help that they need, and most importantly, when they need it, so they can break that cycle of contact with DCJ, and that we can give them the tools to live their best lives. A big important part of that work is obviously tapping into the wisdom of our staff here in DCJ, both Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal, and in Southwest Sydney and Orange, that work has been underway for a while now, talking to staff from youth justice, from correctives, from child protection, from out of home care, and all of the other relevant parts of DCJ coming together to talk about how we can do things differently for families that have multiple contacts. It's been a really strong focus on place-based solutions in those locations, really bringing people together to talk about what we can be doing better, really reinforcing and putting across all of the work in Aboriginal lens, being very family focused and human-centred in our design, and really trying to understand what One DCJ really means in practice. We're an agency that came together because someone at the time saw the benefits of pulling child protection and justice together, and families and communities work together to generate better outcomes for families. So really seeing what that looks like in each of these locations. And there's been a lot of focus on bringing in other parts of the New South Wales government as well. So that connection with education and training, and looking at other health spaces that are determinants of people's and families' well-being. So it's a really important piece. There's been a lot of discussions around making sure that everything involving Aboriginal families is Aboriginal led. So consulting with communities and talking to them about designing ways in which they want to be involved in these matters, and for them to determine what the best way for that is to do. So next week we're off to Orange to have some conversations, because I've been very lucky to be in the chair for the last 3 weeks over in the One Mob, One Job team, understanding a little bit more about this work and working with them to identify opportunities. And one of the things that is being explored, I'm very excited about, because it's one of the models that we've seen work really well in Youth Koori Court that I was going to talk to a little today. And I got the opportunity to sit down with one of the young girls who is a participant in Youth Koori Court, who was being managed by both Youth Justice and then had child protection matters. And the casework coordinators, they're Aboriginal identified roles in Youth Koori Court. We have them in Parramatta. One's about to start in Surrey Hills, and we have one in Dubbo. And those roles are really there to support the caseworkers in either system, to advocate for the young person, to make sure that they're getting everything that they need, and to provide all of that service and support in the middle that both caseworkers don't have the capacity to meet. So it's really about filling the gap in service delivery, so the young person and their family stay engaged. They really understand what they need to do. They understand any legal conditions they have, and they understand how they can navigate the system and get the help that they need. And it's been a really important part of Youth Koori Court in terms of its support for young people. And the insights that the young girl specifically shared with me about feeling supported was that she felt like she had someone she could ring, the caseworkers as well as the casework coordinator, built that trust and that connection with that young girl, so she wasn't afraid to pick up a call and make a call when she knew she might be struggling to meet some of her conditions, or make an appointment at Youth Justice, so then support could be wrapped around or solutions could be identified so she could get where she needed to get, so she wouldn't get breached, or wouldn't have any issues with her fulfilling her supervision requirements. And it's those practical supports. Sometimes it's as simple as helping them with some clothing or some food, helping them with an Opal card, and being able to be there to assist when a crisis happens and the young person needs support in that at a particular point in time. And that continues to grow because each young person is unique and different. And I think a really key part of those roles is the casework coordinator is there when the wheels fall off and things don't go right. Because sometimes relationships break down, and casework coordinators have been a really important part of helping young people and their families repair those relationships, understand what's going on, so the case management that's provided by the YJs or child protection out of home care can continue, and the best interest of the child and their family is at the centre of all of that work. So there's really exciting solutions coming out of the One Mob, One Job one job work in southwest Sydney, and I'm really excited to see what happens in Orange because it's a very different Aboriginal community, one that's very diverse given it's been a resettlement town, and families from all over Western New South Wales are in Orange, so the community infrastructure is a little bit different but very strong. And it really builds on the strengths of working with Aboriginal families and amplifying their strengths. And looking at the other ways in which they can work with them to support real self-determination in the work that we do. So it's early days, but very exciting days. And I think a really great example of how we can, as DCJ, come together and leverage off the strengths of all of our caseworkers and all of the different things that we do, so we can centre it around the family and give them everything that they need to be safe and strong.
Thanks, Edwina. I just finish off with asking each of you, starting with Susan, what's one final thing that you would like the people here today to think about?
I would just echo Jason's words around, a lot of these difficulties can be like within the systems, but what you all do as workers makes a huge difference, those little things, and the relationship being at the centre of it all.
Great, thanks. Catherine?
Similar theme. I think those relationships with the young person, with their families, with other services, like it's just so critical.
Jason?
Yeah, young person's culture, safety and wellbeing is a priority. It should be at the forefront. Be humble. Make sure that our practices meet the needs of our young people. And if we start and stop there, we should be pretty right.
Yeah. And Edwina?
Yeah, I think one thing I'd like to share, we always love the Gough Whitlam quote in my team of maintain your age and enthusiasm. And I feel like it's very specific to Aboriginal affairs and the work that we do. But a really important part of anything we do needs to be shaped by the community and our Aboriginal community controlled organisations. And there's a lot of work to do what we need to do to strengthen the sector. So I'd really encourage people to think about, if they're in the procurement space or doing funding, to really think about the types of organisations we're approaching, because we know when Aboriginal services and people are involved that we generate better outcomes, and we have to create opportunities for us to invest in the sector and for us to invest in our Aboriginal staff, Torres Strait Islander staff in DCJ as well. So we can really leverage off the strengths that we have internally and then support those out in the community to help do that work, because sometimes DCJ might not be the most appropriate place for families to go to for help, and being able to have a service system that we can really build up and rely on to provide that support is really critical. So
thanks. So I'd just like to thank Susan and the panel again. Just a great presentation and fantastic discussion in the panel. If people had any questions that they put in the chat that didn't get answered throughout the session or the panel, please feel free to email the Research Partnerships team, and they'll reach out to the individual people and try and get a response. So thank you everyone for joining us today. As I said, at the beginning, everyone registered will receive an email link to the recording in the next week or so, and additional materials are on our Lunch and Learn website. We have one of these pretty much every month, although not next month. So just subscribe to hear more about them. The link for that is in the chat too, I understand. And so thanks everybody, and have a great rest of the day. Thank you.